If a man is handcuffed, blood trickling down his temple, just because he ordered coffee at a diner, would you believe he's a criminal or a victim of a broken system? And if you were his daughter, what would you do when the whole world believes a lie? This isn't a science fiction movie. It happened in broad daylight. You're watching the series Justice Distorted, and today's episode will make you angry, and then it'll break your heart. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and comment, "I believe in justice," if you still believe the truth can win. Now, let's begin. Gabriel Vaughn, a decorated Black War veteran, once hailed for his valor on foreign soil, only wanted a quiet breakfast at the Copper Table Diner, tucked away in a sunlit suburb. But his life veered off course in just 30 seconds. A door slammed open, rage spilling into the room. Officer Dominic Hayes stormed in, gun already drawn, shouting, "He's armed!" No one had time to think. A baton swung. A cup of coffee shattered. Blood from Gabriel's temple soaked into a white napkin. The 60-year-old man collapsed under the weight of a system that didn't pause to ask, why? From a corner booth, a phone captured the chaos. But the video was later edited, sliced into a narrative that painted Gabriel as the aggressor. On social media, he wasn't a veteran. He was a threat. No court needed. Just pixels, assumptions, and rage. Judgment came frame by frame. Miles away, a young woman gasped. Anastasia Vaughn, his daughter, stared at her screen as her father's bruised face flashed beneath a storm of hateful comments. She clutched her phone, screamed at the silent glass, "That's not my father. He's not like that." Gabriel, blood trailing down his cheek, stood handcuffed and still, but his gaze never dropped. It wasn't defiance. It was clarity. He knew one thing. When the truth is twisted, sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to bow, to start a war worth fighting. Inside the freezing walls of Oakmere Holding Facility, Gabriel Vaughn was shackled for 48 hours straight. No medication, no lawyer, and no one willing to hear him speak. The guards worked in silence with inmates, an underground ring built to manufacture accidents behind solitary doors. Gabriel was beaten so severely he couldn't open his eyes, but he never begged, never broke. He knew one wrong word now would slice into the very core of his honor. Meanwhile, his wife Victoria Langley and daughter Anastasia became the next targets. Their car was tailed. Shadows loomed outside their home night after night. And then fire devoured the house in under 10 minutes. No warning, no evidence. Phones went dead. Signals were jammed. Victoria shoved Anastasia into the car, whispering only one thing before they split up. "You have to live to tell this." Anastasia fled to Maplethorne's safe house, a former wartime relay station, now managed by Alexander Pierce, a retired operative who disappeared from the world after being betrayed by it. But the moment he saw the fear in her eyes, he knew his time in hiding was over. At the same time, Lillian Windsor, a suspended journalist once silenced for investigating the police, released the uncut video. In it, Gabriel was seen calmly wiping his mouth with a napkin. No weapon, no threat. A different angle. A completely different truth. Alexander sent out a signal to those who had once stood for justice but had since gone quiet. The network began to stir. Hackers, investigators, lawyers, even a former judge. This wasn't a war fought with bullets. This one would be fought with truth. When Lillian Windsor's original, unedited clip went viral, public outrage erupted like wildfire. Mainstream media tried to stay quiet, but social networks didn't. Under relentless public pressure, attorney Vincent Monroe forced Westbrook Precinct to disclose Gabriel's detention status. But what no one saw coming was what happened that night. A so-called emergency facility transfer was ordered. En route, the prison van veered off into Ashridge Pines Forest, following a verbal command marked classified. It was a trap. Gabriel was drugged. When a guard drew a knife, a shrill crackle burst through the radio. Julian Carter's voice, impersonating a commanding officer. The confusion bought Gabriel just enough time. He broke free, bolted into the woods, hands still shackled, his heels torn and bleeding from barbed wire. He crawled past the stream, collapsed beneath an old oak, breathing like each second might be his last. By morning, Julian, a teenage clerk at Harbor Light gas station, found him, barely conscious. No questions asked. He draped his jacket over Gabriel, lifted him into the back of a fuel truck, and drove north, straight to Maplethorne's safe house. Meanwhile, a leaked report revealed something chilling. Dominic Hayes, realizing the full video had surfaced, was planning to eliminate Anastasia. His plan? Stage a suicide at an abandoned mill in Old Ironbridge. But this time, Alexander Pierce's team was waiting. A brutal shootout followed. Though barely recovered, Gabriel threw himself in front of his daughter, shielding her as a bullet grazed his side. Hayes fled into the shadows, but his blood stained every inch of that rotting wood floor. Moments later, Vincent Monroe, alongside Judge Scarlett Monroe, announced the reopening of Gabriel's case under emergency hearing. They didn't sugarcoat their stance. We don't stand with the crowd, we stand with the evidence. After the shootout at Old Ironbridge Mill, Anastasia was escorted to Whispergate Witness Protection Center. Meanwhile, Gabriel, still unable to remove the handcuffs, sat in the cold wooden cabin of Pierce, slicing off the bandage from his shoulder with quiet determination. His voice steady, he said, "If I don't stand up, then the children after me will keep their heads down." At that very moment, Vincent Monroe and Scarlett Monroe filed an emergency petition to the Newmore District Court, demanding a full retrial, public, transparent, armed with the unedited footage and newly surfaced testimony. The trial was live-streamed nationwide. An entire country watched. Julian Carter, hands trembling as he held the mic, recounted how he drove through the night to save a man he had never met, simply because his eyes refused to surrender. Lillian presented the raw footage. Gabriel being assaulted before doing anything at all, and surveillance footage from the holding facility, showing Hayes ordering all cameras off for a full 7 hours. And then, the moment that cracked everything wide open, Sterling, a former agent once under Hayes' command, stood up in the courtroom and said, "He threatened to kill me unless I forged the report." Silence. Then a rising wave of applause. Damian Blackwood, a senior officer who once denied Gabriel's appeal, was exposed as a secret funder of the white supremacist group Crimson Cross. He was handcuffed right there in his seat. A nationwide warrant was issued for Dominic Hayes. And for the first time in the town's history, a trial ended not in outrage, but in thunderous applause. Gabriel Vaughn, the wrongfully imprisoned general, was declared fully exonerated. He walked out of the courthouse in the same blood-stained shirt he wore the day he was taken, but this time, his hand was clasped tightly with his daughter's. And Victoria, his wife, stepped forward, leaned in, and kissed his forehead. No words, no grand victory speech, just the quiet return to being human again. After being dragged out of the Copper Table Diner, Gabriel Vaughn wasn't taken to a standard detention center. Instead, he was forced into Oakmere Holding Facility, a place known as the Black Hole with no way out. There, head warden Theodore Wells had long struck a covert alliance with an organized white supremacist gang led by Everett Sinclair. Gabriel was thrown into an isolation cell. All cameras were cut. On his first night, they stripped him, beat him until he lost consciousness, then shoved a confession in front of him, one he never even got to read. On the outside, his wife Victoria Langley and daughter Anastasia became targets. One night, their small home in Whitlock Crescent was set ablaze in silence. No warnings, no media coverage. Just Victoria's phone, swallowed by flames, the very device that held the original audio recording of Gabriel's arrest. Anastasia barely escaped. All she carried was a crumpled piece of paper with one name and address, Alexander Pierce. At Maplethorne's safe house, Pierce, a former soldier and cybersecurity specialist, opened the door to find the daughter of his old friend. "You don't need to say anything," he told her. "I've seen the video." At that exact moment, Lillian Windsor, the only diner customer who had kept the unedited footage, uploaded it online. In the clip, Gabriel wasn't resisting. He was struck before he could even speak, and his eyes were the same as the day he earned his medal, unflinching, unafraid, unbowed. Pierce picked up the phone. He called the old crew, the ones the system had once cast aside. Each of them held a piece of the truth. And from those scattered shards, they began rebuilding something the system thought it had buried long ago: faith. Gabriel Vaughn survived each passing day inside Oakmere, but no one truly knew what it cost him. One morning, a guard claimed to have found a homemade weapon hidden beneath his mattress, a carefully planted setup designed to extend his sentence indefinitely. And without a lawyer, that sentence would have become his life. That night, in the freezing rain of Ashridge Pines Forest, Gabriel made his escape. No shoes, no coat, one arm injured, blood mixed with mud as he stumbled through the dark. And just when his legs gave out, a boy appeared. Julian Carter, working the night shift at Harbor Light gas station, didn't ask questions. He handed Gabriel an old hoodie, just that, simple, quiet. It was the first time in months someone called him by his real name. While Gabriel ran, Pierce uncovered a sinister plan. Dominic Hayes had marked Anastasia as the next target. The location, Old Iron Bridge Mill, an abandoned factory once used for backdoor deals. The confrontation came fast and brutal. Gunshots cracked through the night. Gabriel took a bullet to the shoulder while shielding his daughter. Hayes fled into the dark, but help arrived. Vincent Monroe, a young lawyer who once trained under Gabriel at the military academy, showed up with Judge Scarlett Monroe and an emergency order to reopen the case. From fugitive to fighter, Gabriel now had a shot, not just to survive, but to rip the mask off the system that tried to erase him from the truth. After being dragged out of the diner like a criminal, Gabriel Vaughn was thrown into Oakmere Holding Facility, a place long condemned by the press for its treatment of black inmates. There he was isolated, cut off from legal counsel, forced to write a confession, but Gabriel chose silence. Silence to listen, to observe, to prepare. Meanwhile, his wife Victoria Langley began to sense the eyes watching her and their daughter, Anastasia Bennett. Every time they left the house, the same gray car waited across the street. That night, their home went up in flames. An anonymous message followed: "If the girl talks, she'll disappear like her father." Victoria fled with Anastasia to Maplethorne's safe house, a covert field clinic Gabriel himself had built during his military years. There, Anastasia sent a single-voice message to Alexander Pierce, her father's former comrade, now an independent journalist. Pierce reactivated EchoNet, a covert network of veterans, hackers, and rogue reporters he'd once helped assemble to expose military corruption. And just as he did, Lillian Windsor, the pastry shop owner from the Copper Table Diner, released the original, uncut video of the incident. No edits, no overlays. Just the truth. Gabriel reaching for his wallet. No weapon, no threat. And suddenly, the system began to crack. For the first time, the truth had a voice. And those who had once forgotten Gabriel were rising, quietly, powerfully, one by one. At Oakmere Holding Facility, Gabriel Vaughn endured both physical and psychological torture. In the pitch-black isolation cell, he heard the final screams of another black inmate. And then, only silence. Warden Theodore Wells sneered from the doorway. "You people only look strong on TV. In here, you bow." Outside, Victoria Langley pleaded for help, but no attorney dared touch the case. Every security camera around their home had been disabled. Their daughter, Anastasia Bennett, was forced to flee in the pouring rain, running toward Maplethorne Safe House, the underground base of The Renewal, a resistance network of former soldiers led by none other than Alexander Pierce, Gabriel's old war brother. Soaked, trembling, and nearly out of breath, Anastasia whispered, "I don't need them to believe me. I just need you to see it." Pierce looked at the child standing in the storm, and he knew Gabriel's fight was real. He didn't wait. The call went out. A single name came alive again. EchoNet. Meanwhile, Lillian Windsor, the woman who had filmed the brutal beating, recovered the original memory card. She knew what it would cost her, but still she posted the raw, unedited footage online. That night, her bakery was trashed. 12 hours later, one hashtag blazed across every platform: # Justice for Vaughn. What started as a whisper had become a wildfire. With the help of Genevieve Clark, a reclusive cybersecurity expert, and Lillian Windsor, the woman who filmed the original footage, Pierce's network began tracing a trail of classified documents, exposing the racist machinery Dominic Hayes had been protecting for years. At the same time, after a night of relentless beatings and no way out, Gabriel Vaughn made the impossible decision to escape Oakmere. He crawled through a sewage duct, dragging his body through Ashridge Pines forest. His limbs turned blue from the cold, his old wounds reopened, blood soaking into his clothes. He carried nothing with him, except a crumpled photo of his wife and daughter tucked inside his chest pocket. At Harbor Light gas station, a black teenager named Julian Carter found Gabriel collapsed behind the fuel pumps. No questions, no filming, just a quiet act of humanity. Julian carried him into the basement, patched his wounds, fed him, and said simply, "They see your skin. I see someone who deserves to live." Meanwhile, Alexander Pierce and the renewal team uncovered Hayes's plan to execute Anastasia at an abandoned factory, Old Iron Bridge Mill. The team moved in. A gunfight broke out, brief but brutal. Gabriel, wounded and worn, arrived just in time to shield Pierce from a bullet. He collapsed as Hayes vanished into the darkness. That same night, Vincent Monroe, a young attorney once forced out of his job by Hayes for investigating racial bias, filed a petition to the court. The twist? The judge who accepted it was none other than his sister, Scarlett Monroe, who had once been suspended for defying the same system. Gabriel lay unconscious, but for the first time, the system took a step back. Gabriel Vaughn didn't escape on instinct. It was a plan etched into his mind over countless sleepless nights. Every guard rotation, every blind spot, every second between camera shifts, memorized like scripture. He dismantled a sewage pipe beneath Oakmere Holding Facility, crawling like a phantom through the underbrush of Ashridge Pines. Hounds chased him. Gunshots cracked past his ear. Blood loss blurred his vision. But he kept going. When it seemed capture was inevitable at Harbor Light gas station, salvation came from the most unexpected place, a night shift teenager named Julian Carter. Without hesitation, Julian dragged Gabriel into a supply room, locked the door, and held his breath as patrol lights swept past the windows. "I don't need to know who you are," he whispered. "I just know what it's like to be hit because of your skin." Meanwhile, Alexander Pierce and the renewal team uncovered Dominic Hayes's next move, the planned execution of Anastasia at the abandoned Old Iron Bridge Mill. The team split, one group to create diversion, the other to infiltrate the site. The gunfire was sharp, chaotic. Gabriel arrived in the thick of it, diving in front of Pierce to take the hit, then dragging Anastasia from a warehouse already engulfed in flames. Back at headquarters, Vincent Monroe, once stripped of his license, released a sealed dossier revealing financial ties between Hayes and a known white supremacist organization. That night, he and Judge Scarlett Monroe filed a petition to reopen the case before a special state tribunal. Gabriel was brought back alive, barely. But for the first time, the game no longer belonged to the system. After a near-fatal escape through the wilds of Ashridge Pines, Gabriel Vaughn was running on fumes, until salvation came in the form of Julian Carter, a night shift teen at Harbor Light gas station. No questions asked. Julian tossed him a hoodie, stashed him in the back of a delivery van, and said, "I don't know who you are, but if they're hunting you like this, then you must have told a truth they couldn't handle." At that very moment, Alexander Pierce received intel. Dominic Hayes was planning to eliminate Anastasia at Old Iron Bridge Mill, an abandoned warehouse long forgotten. Time was up. The renewal network had to strike. Genevieve Clark led the breach team herself, while Pierce and Victoria Langley raced toward the coordinates. Rain poured as gunfire erupted. Amid smoke and burning fuel, Gabriel emerged, blood soaking through a torn shirt, but still moving. Still fighting, he threw himself in front of the shot aimed at his daughter. The gunfire fell silent. Hayes vanished into the storm, leaving behind 2 injured bodies and a memory Anastasia would never forget. That night, Vincent Monroe stood before a national camera and dropped the hammer. Bank documents showing direct payments to Dominic Hayes from the White Order Trust, a known backer of extremist hate groups. Scarlett Monroe, now reinstated as a federal judge, wasted no time. She issued the order. The case of Gabriel Vaughn would be reopened immediately. The breaking point had arrived. Now it was time to flip the system on its head. News of Gabriel Vaughn's escape from Oakmere Holding Facility sent shockwaves through the system. Panic spread behind closed doors. Meanwhile, Anastasia was moved to what was believed to be a final safe house, Old Iron Bridge Mill, unaware it was the very trap Dominic Hayes had laid. That night, as a heavy fog rolled in like a curtain hiding sins, Hayes and three armed men stormed the abandoned factory, their guns cocked without hesitation. But they didn't know Alexander Pierce had already been waiting. The firefight erupted in flickering flashlight beams and the relentless hammer of rain against rusted steel. Despite his injuries, Gabriel hurled himself in front of Anastasia the moment he saw a barrel aimed at her. The bullet tore through his shoulder, blood soaking through his shirt, but his eyes never left his daughter. In the darkest moment, Julian Carter, the teenager who once hid Gabriel in a gas station basement, emerged from the shadows. He fired a warning shot, just enough to force a distraction. Hayes took a bullet to the arm, but managed to vanish into the forest. As he disappeared, his voice snarled through the rain. "You can run, Vaughn, but I'm not done." That same night, Vincent Monroe called an emergency press conference. Backed by evidence gathered by Lillian Windsor and Genevieve Clark, he revealed it all. Hayes had accepted funding from the White Cross Initiative, a known white supremacist group. The documents even included a targeted cleansing list, and the very first name struck out was Gabriel Vaughn. Federal Judge Scarlett Monroe signed the order to reopen the case, demanding a full jury be summoned at Newmore District Court. The war had turned. From this point forward, justice wouldn't be assumed. It would be fought for, with blood and truth. Gabriel Vaughn was rushed to St. Bellamy Recovery Center, blood still soaking through his weathered military coat. In a haze of pain and fading consciousness, he whispered, "Don't let them touch her," his final plea before slipping under. But outside those hospital walls, the battle raged on. Armed with a mountain of evidence compiled by Lillian Windsor and Genevieve Clark, Vincent Monroe stepped into the heart of Newmore Square and held an emergency press conference. Before a stunned crowd, he unveiled the full web of corruption that had buried justice, exposing collusion from prison officials to local law enforcement, all the way to district court judges. The unedited footage, the brutal beating at the diner, was broadcast live. The nation watched, and the outrage spread like fire. Federal Judge Scarlett Monroe made it official. The case of State versus Vaughn would be reopened. The trial would be live-streamed across the country. Millions tuned in. Inside the courtroom, Julian Carter stepped forward, not just as a witness, but as a symbol. A teenager who had once been lied to, who now chose to stand with truth. His testimony cut through the noise like a blade. Damian Blackwood, the director of Oakmere, was arrested in front of the jury. His secret ties to the White Cross Initiative and his long-standing alliance with Dominic Hayes had finally been exposed under the weight of undeniable truth. And then, the verdict came. Gabriel Vaughn was fully exonerated. He stepped out of the courthouse, arms still bandaged, his stride slow but unbroken. No more flashing cameras. No accusations. Just Victoria Langley and Anastasia running toward him, collapsing into his arms. The tears this time weren't for grief, but for everything they had almost lost and somehow reclaimed. This wasn't just the clearing of a name. It was the return of a father, a husband, a man who had once been stripped of everything, now restored by the faith of a community that finally chose to see him. Gabriel Vaughn was still recovering at St. Bellamy Recovery Center, his body weakened but his spirit intact. Outside those walls, however, his old comrades weren't wasting a second. Nathaniel Sterling, a battle-hardened general who'd once bled beside Gabriel, returned from Washington carrying a sealed dossier. It had been buried deep, blocked by the very forces protecting Hayes. Inside, undeniable proof of Oakmere Prison's covert ties to the extremist group known as White Cross. Vincent Monroe and Scarlett Monroe filed an emergency petition to the Newmore District Court. This was no longer just a trial about one man. This was a reckoning, a courtroom built to shine a light on an entire system of deceit that had gone unchecked for years. Broadcast to a nationwide audience, the trial began. Anastasia Bennett, her voice trembling but resolute, stepped onto the witness stand. She recounted the night their home burned, the panic in her mother's voice before the call dropped, and the promise she made to never stay silent, not for herself, but for her father. Then came Lillian Windsor. She played the raw video, no edits, no narration, capturing Hayes' voice as he gave the chilling order. "Take care of it on site. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Genevieve Clark followed, testifying from her small community clinic. She presented forensic evidence that the wounds on Gabriel's body didn't match the police reports. The truth no longer whispered, it thundered. And finally, the hammer dropped. Damian Blackwood, warden of Oakmere, was exposed for accepting financial support from White Cross to clear the path for a rising political force. He was handcuffed in the courtroom before he could even reach for his phone. Gabriel Vaughn was declared fully exonerated. As the courtroom doors opened, he stepped into the golden light of late afternoon. Each step was slow, deliberate. Waiting for him were Victoria and Anastasia, no longer shadows in a nightmare, but home, real and whole. For the first time since it all began, Gabriel smiled. Not because he'd won, but because he knew. This time, he was no longer alone in the fight for truth. The courtroom was dead silent as Judge Scarlett Monroe pressed her pen to the final ruling, nullifying every decision made by the corrupt regime that once manipulated the scales of justice. Her eyes never left Gabriel, not as a defendant, but as a living emblem of a system that had once collapsed and was now learning how to rise again. Outside the courthouse, a wave of applause burst through the crowd as Gabriel Vaughn wrapped his arms around Victoria and Anastasia. Lillian captured the moment on camera, and that video would become the most shared clip of the week, not because it was shocking, but because it healed. 1 week later, at Stone Glen Hollow, Gabriel hammered a wooden sign into the gate of the small farm where he'd once grown up. Carved into it were the words, "Vaughn Farm, we grow truth, not fear." Anastasia came running from the house, tugging at her father's hand. "Dad, Mom says there'll be a meteor shower tonight." Gabriel smiled. "Then we'll make a wish. Not for us, but for those who still haven't seen justice." Elsewhere, in a forest-shadowed cabin, Dominic Hayes stared at a map of the United States. A scar cut down the side of his face, a remnant of the shootout he didn't win. His right hand spun a marker, circling cities already cleansed. Inked along his arm, the Crimson Cross. He whispered, "They think this is over? Next time, I won't be alone." The screen fades to black. Only one line echoes, "Truth is a seed, and one day it will bloom where no one expects." No one expected the turning point to come from a nameless teenager at a gas station. Julian Carter, nervous, trembling, but resolute, took the witness stand in the public trial at Newmore District Court. From his pocket, he produced a memory card containing security footage, images of Hayes and two accomplices exchanging weapons before the staged arrest of Gabriel. The video was paired with a secret audio diary Gabriel had recorded while in prison, capturing a chilling threat from Everett Sinclair, the white supremacist inmate leader. Simultaneously, Lillian Windsor, the one who had captured the initial footage, submitted the original, unedited recording. Layer by layer, the truth began to shed its disguises, bolstered by internal military documents unearthed by Nathaniel Sterling from deep within classified databases. Then came the climax. When Vincent Monroe finished his closing argument, the courtroom fell silent as Judge Scarlett Monroe took the floor. With a steady voice, she announced the immediate dismissal of the entire original prosecution team, replacing them with an independent task force under direct court oversight. Applause broke out, a release of years of silence and rage. But in the wave of celebration, no one noticed Gabriel quietly slump back into his chair, blood still seeping through the bandage on his shoulder. Anastasia gripped his hand tight. "We made it, Dad," she whispered. Gabriel looked up past the marble ceiling of the courtroom. No longer a cold white void, just open sky. Vast, free, wider than any wall that had ever tried to contain him. As the trial reached its boiling point, evidence and testimonies had piled up, each one a blow to the illusion of order. But it was a single final twist that shattered the mask of those who had twisted justice for so long. Before the full glare of national media and a courtroom holding its breath, Vincent Monroe unveiled the blow that no one saw coming. Documents gathered by Nathaniel Sterling proving that Damian Blackwood, the once respected prosecutor who led the charge against Gabriel, was in fact a high-ranking member of a white supremacist organization. Emails, secret photographs, transaction records. Even an audio file, Blackwood's own voice conspiring with Dominic Hayes to orchestrate Gabriel's downfall. It was all laid bare, without filter, without mercy. The courtroom descended into chaos as judicial marshals stepped forward to escort Blackwood away. He turned, clinging to whatever sliver of control he had left, but it was too late. That brief, broken glance, equal parts denial and defeat, cut through every camera lens and into the hearts of viewers across the country. It was the kind of moment that made people pause, because it showed some pay for truth with their comfort, others pay with their freedom, and a few pay with everything. Gabriel didn't speak. He simply looked towards Scarlett Monroe, who had stood against the old guard, risking her career and safety to let the truth be heard. Anastasia wept as her father's name was cleared at last. The courtroom roared, but outside the air still buzzed with a mix of anger and uncertainty. Trust had been fractured, and no one knew if justice would hold or if this moment was just a rare, fleeting spark. Cut to the hallway. Gabriel gripped his daughter's hand tightly. Across the atrium, barely visible in the crowd, the silhouette of Dominic Hayes slipped out of sight, a shadow that lingered like a warning. The wounds of this system won't heal overnight. They may take generations. When Judge Scarlett Monroe declared, "Gabriel Vaughn is hereby fully exonerated," the courtroom fell into absolute silence, then erupted in thunderous, unrelenting applause. But what left everyone breathless wasn't that announcement. It was what came next. And by order of the Federal Military Council, the rank of four-star general, once stripped under false charges, is hereby reinstated. Gabriel stood frozen, still dressed in a faded prison uniform. His fists clenched, his chest heaved. And then, from the back of the courtroom, a familiar figure stepped forward. General Nathaniel Sterling. The seasoned officer walked solemnly toward him and pinned the stolen emblem of honor back onto Gabriel's chest. The entire nation watched as a single tear slid down the face of a man who had never bowed to hate, yet now trembled before the weight of justice restored. Anastasia rushed into her father's arms, sobbing against him, her cries echoing through the marble halls. Victoria stood nearby, silent, eyes rimmed red, lips trembling with words she couldn't form. News outlets lit up with headlines. Historic compensation for the soldier America once forgot. But for Gabriel, it was never about the money, not the rank. It was the embrace of his daughter, the quiet respect in the crowd's gaze, the truth finally breathing free. That was the only reward he ever wanted. And in the courthouse courtyard, someone held up a hand-lettered sign that said, "Justice isn't delayed, it's reclaimed." Right after the trial, under the watchful eyes of the media and millions across the country, the Vaughn family was quietly escorted to Frostbend Hideaway, a secluded log cabin deep in the northern woods of Stoneglen Hollow. Once an abandoned rest stop, the place had been rebuilt, not as a monument of victory, but as a quiet symbol of what truly mattered. No parades, no medals, just peace, earned through blood, loss, and unshakable resolve. On their first night, Anastasia placed an old family photo on the wooden table, her voice barely a whisper. "Are we really safe now, Dad?" Gabriel didn't answer. He knelt by the fire, opened his hand, once clenched inside cold steel cuffs, and laid it over the scar that had just begun to heal. And then he whispered, "Truth can be hidden, but it can never be killed." Victoria stepped behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. She said nothing, but the tears that fell onto his shirt, warm and real, meant more than any blanket they'd ever owned. Outside, snow began to fall. A hand-carved wooden sign stood beneath the old oak tree. "Welcome to Vaughn Farm. No fear grows here." It didn't scream. It didn't need to. It was a vow, quiet, unshakable. They hadn't just survived. They had begun again, on a piece of land where faith was growing back, one silent root at a time. Far from the courtroom lights, deep within the forgotten wilderness of Crimson Vale Lodge, Dominic Hayes was still alive. He sat alone in a crumbling wooden room, staring into a cold, dead fireplace. His fingers traced the scar left by Gabriel's bullet. Inked across his right wrist, the crimson cross wasn't just a mark. It was a vow and a curse. "I'll come back, and this time, I won't be alone." Behind him, the wall was covered in maps, cut-up newspaper clippings, and leaked files from inside the court. At the center, Gabriel's photo, not defaced, not ridiculed, marked, a target. Under the dim oil lamp, scrawled in red ink, one line stood out. Operation Omega, family, truth, faith, must be burned at the root. But what Hayes didn't know was that Gabriel Vaughn was no longer alone, not just because of Victoria, not just because of Anastasia, but because he had become a symbol, one that couldn't be edited, silenced, or erased, a beacon for a generation unwilling to be mislabeled, framed, or feared simply for the color of their skin, or their refusal to be quiet. Gabriel had planted a seed of truth, and now thousands were ready to rise beside him. What if one day truth was hunted like a crime? If you believe justice must be reclaimed, not granted, drop a comment below. If Gabriel's journey moved you, hit follow and walk with us into the next chapter. This isn't the end. It's only the beginning. There are verdicts that don't need to be spoken in a courtroom. They're carved deep into the eyes of a man once dragged across the floor of a crowded diner, simply because he wore a face the system refused to believe could be innocent. Gabriel Vaughn's story isn't just about clearing his name. It's a reminder that true justice isn't written on paper. It's how we choose to stand for what's right, even if we stand alone. Gabriel was once a general, honored for defending his country, but in a blink, with a single doctored video, he was cast as a threat to everything he had sworn to protect. Not because he changed, but because the system decided to redefine him through fear and prejudice. And yet, he didn't seek revenge. He didn't shout. He chose truth as his weapon and love as his shield. And in the calmest, bravest moments, from breaking out of a cage to shielding his daughter, to that quiet embrace on the courthouse steps, he made the world stop and look again. The greatest lesson here is this: truth doesn't need to be shouted, it needs to be lived. And sometimes healing doesn't come from external victories, but from refusing to become the version of ourselves that injustice tries to mold. Gabriel wasn't just acquitted, he was reclaimed as a human being, and this time, it was by his own choice.